What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. The real story that inspired Lolita is somehow more disturbing than the actual book. Russian-American novelist Vladimir Nabokov wrote the novel Lolita in 1955 that drew inspiration from the true crime Sally Horner kidnapping, but the real-life story that inspired it is more disturbing than the book itself. Lolita is narrated by a middle-aged man named Humbert, who fixates on a 12-year-old girl named Dolores Hayes, Lolita, and forces her into a sexual relationship. In the novel, Dolores eventually escapes from Humbert, who has an emotional breakdown. When they eventually see each other again, Dolores is pregnant but suffering financially. Despite her difficult circumstances, she has overcome her past and made a life for herself. There's a glimpse of a better future. Florence Sally Horner was abducted in 1948 by a man who repeatedly sexually assaulted her for 2 years. She was finally rescued only to be victim blamed by the media, and died tragically 2 years later at age 15. Sally Horner, unfortunately, wasn't given the time to move on from the trauma she experienced as an adolescent. Both Sally's story and Lolita have a lot in common. They took place in nearly the exact same year, and both girls were nearly the same age with single mothers. Even so, scholars didn't make the connection between the book and the history until more than 50 years following publication. It's always chilling when uncomfortable fiction turns out to be based in truth, and with subject matter like Lolita, the truth is even darker. A shoplifting incident changed her life forever. On June 13, 1948, just before her 5th grade graduation, 11-year-old Florence Sally Horner tried to steal a 5-cent notebook at a Woolworth's in Camden, New Jersey. The crime was part of an initiation into a girls' club at her school that she really wanted to join, and although this would be the first time she'd attempted to steal anything, she was willing to do it to be part of the popular crowd. Her classmates insisted that it would be simple, and she wouldn't get caught. She was caught by a man claiming to be an FBI agent. Sally, an inexperienced thief, didn't get away free and clear with the notebook from the 5-and-dime store. A man spotted her trying to steal it and told her he was an FBI agent. She was terrified of the man, who began spinning a web of lies about the law that Sally had no reason not to believe. To her relief, he told her that he wouldn't take her to jail, but that she would need to check in with him from now on. Presumably, this was because he was doing her a big favor by letting her go. Thankful, she returned home to her mother, only to be intercepted the next day after school by the man. Sally's home life was not always easy. When the purported FBI agent first let Sally go after the notebook incident, the young girl was extremely relieved. She didn't know what would have happened if she had been arrested. Her mother, Ella, worked hard as a seamstress to make ends meet. Her father, who was an alcoholic, had committed suicide when she was just 6 years old, so Ella was a single mother. Meanwhile, Sally's older sister, Susan, was pregnant. An arrest would have made things very difficult for her family, and besides, Sally couldn't wait to be an aunt. LaSalle tricked her into going to Atlantic City. Sally's relief at not being arrested for the notebook shoplifting incident didn't last long. The man had clearly followed Sally, and after school the next day he intercepted her. He told her his name was Frank LaSalle, and he convinced the young girl that she should be thankful that he caught her stealing and nobody else did, and that she must obey his demands, which included going with him to Atlantic City. LaSalle explained that the government needed her to go with him, and if she refused she would be sent to reform school. Sally lied to her mother, explaining that she was taking a beach trip with a classmate and her father. Later, it would turn out that LaSalle was actually a 50-year-old mechanic, although Sally still didn't know that. LaSalle's rap sheet included rape, assault, child molestation and more. It turns out that LaSalle was an ex-con who committed a number of crimes, mainly horrifying ones against young girls. Prior to meeting Sally, he'd been convicted of rape and arrested for bigamy, indecent assault and enticing minors. Other media reports claimed he had a history of child molestation. Just 6 months before he kidnapped Sally, LaSalle completed a prison sentence for statutory rape. LaSalle posed as Sally's father and moved her from Atlantic City to Maryland to Texas. Atlantic City was not a far drive from Camden, where Sally grew up. She and LaSalle spent 6 weeks in Atlantic City, while her mother still believed she was vacationing with a schoolmate. Then LaSalle took the young girl to Baltimore, Maryland. At first, they were accompanied by a young woman in her 20s whom LaSalle called Miss Robinson. He claimed she was his secretary. She left shortly afterwards, and he and Sally moved to Dallas, Texas. Sally continued to stay with LaSalle, still believing he would turn her in to authorities for the notebook theft. According to a Washington Post article from that time, Sally pretended to be his daughter and even attended parochial schools in Baltimore and Dallas. LaSalle had an itch for young girls and married his wife Dorothy when she was 17. LaSalle had been married before he abducted Sally. He'd met his wife, Dorothy Dare, when she was only 17 years old and a recent high school graduate. LaSalle was using an assumed name and age, and was more than twice Dorothy's age. But Dorothy felt constrained by her father's strict rules, and eagerly ran off with LaSalle. Dorothy's father was upset that his daughter, a minor, was dating an older man and secured warrants against LaSalle. He was arrested under the pseudonym Frank Fogg in Pennsylvania, but released after producing a legal marriage certificate to Dorothy. They even had a child together, but eventually Dorothy sued him for neglect and lack of support. LaSalle, it turned out, was out preying on other young girls, but it's unconfirmed if Dorothy was aware of this. A neighbor helped to rescue Sally. While living in a trailer park in Dallas, neighbor Ruth Yanish noticed something amiss between LaSalle and his daughter Sally. She tried talking to the young girl, but Sally was afraid to reveal anything. Ruth Yanish's intuition, however, remained. When Ruth and her husband later moved to San Jose, Yanish hatched a plan to fish more information out of Sally. She wrote a letter to LaSalle, recommending he relocate to San Jose too because there were a lot of work opportunities. LaSalle agreed, and in March of 1950 he and Sally drove LaSalle's mobile home to San Jose. Leaving the car hitched to the trailer, LaSalle took the bus into the city to look for work, leaving Sally alone. Yanish coerced the girl into coming over to her trailer and opening up a little more, even offering her the phone to call her family members. Although no one picked up at her mother's home, Sally called her sister Susan, whose husband contacted the FBI. Sally was removed from LaSalle's home before he returned from his job hunt. LaSalle insisted Sally was his daughter during his trial. When Sally was rescued by authorities, she had spent nearly 2 years in captivity. She revealed to her rescuers that she was forced to have sex with LaSalle, and LaSalle was arrested as he arrived back at the trailer park from his day of job hunting. LaSalle was sent to trial, at which he wouldn't budge from his claim that Sally was his daughter and that he did not kidnap her. In fact, Sally was forced to make a statement that LaSalle was not her father. She said, "My real daddy died when I was 6 and I remember what he looks like. I never saw this man before that day at the dime store." He pleaded guilty and received 30 to 35 years at Trenton State Prison. After her rescue, Sally was the target of victim blaming. While the newspapers in 13-year-old Sally's hometown tended to paint a sympathetic portrait of the young girl's abduction, much of the media also engaged in its share of victim blaming, pointing out that Sally wouldn't have been so vulnerable if she hadn't shoplifted. The Associated Press described her as chubby, and other papers called her plump and husky even though she was 110 pounds and 5 feet tall. They also published her name, which happens rarely today in cases involving minors and sexual crimes. Some outlets even included the times and places LaSalle had sex with Sally. Sally died tragically 2 years later and her abductor sent her family flowers. Sally struggled to return to ordinary life following her 2 years of sexual captivity. In the 1950s, there was little research about the effect of such a traumatic experience on adolescents, so her treatment was likely inadequate. She was rescued in spring 1950, but she died 2 years later at the age of 15 somewhat mysteriously in a car crash with a fellow she may have just met that night. In a twisted show of support, LaSalle sent Sally's family flowers for the funeral. They refused to accept them. It was the only time LaSalle attempted to reach out to Sally's family following his trial. LaSalle died in prison 16 years after his sentencing. The day after Sally called her family from San Jose, LaSalle was arrested for violating the Mann Act, which was enacted in 1910 to prevent interstate sex trafficking. Following his arrest, LaSalle pleaded guilty to kidnapping charges. A prosecutor from Camden County, New Jersey, called LaSalle a moral leper. He was sentenced to 30 to 35 years in prison. LaSalle died in lockup in 1966 at the age of 70 from arteriosclerosis. Lolita actually mentions the Sally Horner case specifically, but most historians didn't realize the connection for 50 years. Nabokov originally wrote Lolita as a short story in Russian, but several years after moving to the United States decided to rework it as a novel in English. Despite having a journal full of clippings about the Sally Horner case, and even referencing her story directly in the novel, no one really followed up on making the connection between Nabokov's work of fiction and the real-life tragedy of Sally Horner. Diving deeper into Lolita, there's a lot of literary symbolism and elements that Nabokov draws out of the true crime reports and embellishes for his work, such as the imagery of phones. The unsettling truth behind Vladimir Nabokov's infamous 1955 novel Lolita is that it wasn't purely a fictional work born from literary genius and dark imagination. It was, in fact, deeply rooted in the real-life tragedy of Florence Sally Horner, a young girl whose life was shattered by a predator named Frank LaSalle. While Nabokov's prose is haunting and his unreliable narrator, Humbert, is one of the most chilling characters in literature, the fictional torment he inflicts upon 12-year-old Dolores Lolita Hayes pales in comparison to the actual horrors that Sally Horner endured. Sally's story is so deeply disturbing not just because of what happened to her, but because it remained largely unacknowledged and obscured for decades, even as Nabokov's novel gained global fame. It's only in recent years that the literary world and the public have begun to confront the extent to which Lolita was inspired by a true crime, and that this inspiration wasn't just tangential, but central. Nabokov denied it at times, or remained evasively cryptic about his sources, but the parallels are impossible to ignore. The kidnapping, abuse, and psychological manipulation Sally Horner endured at the hands of Frank LaSalle are mirrored in disturbing detail in Lolita, and yet the book gave her no credit. It's a chilling reminder that real pain often fuels fiction, and that the line between a brilliant novel and an exploited victim is far thinner than anyone would like to admit. Sally Horner's life was derailed in June of 1948, when, just 11 years old and hoping to join a girls' club at school, she attempted to steal a 5-cent notebook from a Woolworth store in Camden, New Jersey. It was supposed to be a harmless rite of passage among schoolgirls, a dare that would earn her membership into a social circle she longed to be part of. But standing nearby was a man who changed her fate forever. Frank LaSalle, a 50-something-year-old ex-convict with a rap sheet filled with crimes against children. Posing as an FBI agent, LaSalle cornered Sally, terrified her with threats of jail time, then generously offered to let her off the hook, on the condition that she report to him regularly. That initial encounter was a carefully calculated act of psychological grooming. Sally, coming from a struggling household headed by her widowed mother, didn't have the experience or support to question his intentions. Her father had died by suicide when she was just 6, and her mother Ella, a hard-working seamstress, was stretched thin emotionally and financially. Sally idolized her pregnant older sister and looked forward to becoming an aunt. The fear of bringing shame or more stress upon her already burdened family made her easy prey for a predator who understood how to exploit children's vulnerabilities. In a twisted manipulation of power, LaSalle convinced Sally that she had no choice but to obey him, and soon, that meant traveling with him to Atlantic City under the pretense of being on a beach trip with a classmate's family. She lied to her mother to make the trip sound normal, and so began a 2-year odyssey of captivity, abuse, and relocation that spanned multiple states and identities. LaSalle, far from being an FBI agent, was a serial predator who had previously been convicted of rape and statutory rape, and had a disturbing history of marrying or molesting underage girls. In Sally's case, he posed as her father, enrolled her in parochial schools in Baltimore and Dallas, and used threats of reform school and jail to ensure her silence. Along the way, they encountered people who suspected something was wrong. These interests weren't just a private hobby. They shaped the very foundation of Mary Poppins, infusing the character with archetypal elements of the divine feminine, the trickster, and the mythic guide. Scholars have noted that Mary Poppins isn't just a nanny. She's a mystical figure, akin to a shaman or a goddess, who comes and goes at will, brings transformation, and speaks in riddles. This metaphysical dimension is largely absent in the Disney adaptation, which sanitized and sweetened the original stories into a candy-colored musical. In fact, Travers famously hated the 1964 Disney film. Walt Disney had spent over 2 decades trying to get the rights to her books, and she only gave in due to financial pressures. She detested almost everything about the final product: the animation, the songs, the portrayal of her characters, and was reduced to tears at the film's premiere. She later banned Disney from adapting any of her other works and ensured in her will that no American could ever write a sequel or spin-off. Her disapproval was rooted not only in personal artistic pride, but in a deeper frustration that Disney had stripped Mary Poppins of her mystical and mythic elements, reducing her to a perky cartoon rather than a symbol of cosmic balance. But if Travers was uncompromising in her artistic vision, she was also a product of her time, and not always in a good way. Her early childhood influences included books like Little Black Sambo and the Uncle Remus stories, works steeped in racist caricatures that she loved as a child. Unfortunately, some of those racial stereotypes bled into her own work. One early Mary Poppins story featured the magical nanny taking the children on a tour around the world, where they encounter various cultural groups rendered in offensive and stereotypical language, including Southern Black Americans who speak in Pickaninny dialects. In later years, Travers acknowledged the racism but tried to excuse it by saying, "Mary Poppins was written a long time ago when racism was not as important." Later editions of the books quietly removed the offending sections, but the damage was done. Despite these flaws, Travers was a fiercely independent thinker who sought out radical experiences and eschewed traditional domestic roles. In the 1940s, she and her adopted son spent time living among Native Americans in the American Southwest, including the Hopi and Navajo peoples. She was fascinated by their storytelling traditions and even received an honorary name from one of the tribes, an experience that only deepened her belief in the universal power of myth. Throughout her life, Travers used travel as both escape and inspiration, whether she was wandering the deserts of Arizona, studying Hindu texts in India, or exploring the socialist streets of pre-war Moscow. In fact, she published a travel memoir titled Moscow Excursion after her visit to the Soviet Union during the early 1930s. While she never officially declared herself a socialist, the themes in her books, including the dignity of labor, the importance of imagination over profit, and skepticism toward the ruling class, reveal her ideological leanings. It's almost comical that Walt Disney, a staunch capitalist, built a cinematic empire on the back of a book series with subtle socialist undertones. Mary Poppins champions ordinary working-class people, from the bird woman to the chimney sweeps, and critiques the sterile world of banking and finance, most famously in the song Fidelity Fiduciary Bank, which lampoons the absurdities of capitalism. But for all her artistic brilliance, Travers could be an extremely difficult person. She clashed with publishers, alienated friends, and was often described as prickly, controlling, and emotionally distant, traits reflected in the no-nonsense personality of Mary Poppins herself. She lived alone for most of her later life, fiercely guarding her privacy and turning down numerous interview requests. She insisted on complete control over how her books were illustrated, marketed, and edited, and she spent decades resisting Hollywood's attempts to co-opt her legacy. In old age, she continued to write and publish, eventually releasing the 8th and final Mary Poppins book in 1988, nearly 54 years after the first. When she died in 1996 at the age of 96, she left behind a literary legacy that was both celebrated and misunderstood. While the world remembered her as the creator of a magical nanny with a flying umbrella, very few understood the complexity of the woman behind the fiction. Her painful childhood, marked by the loss of her father to alcoholism, financial instability, and emotional neglect, shaped her into someone who both feared and craved control. Her creative genius was fueled by her fascination with myth, psychology, and the sacred feminine. Her choices, From her romantic affairs to her esoteric spiritualism to her controversial adoption of a child under the guidance of an astrologer, defied the norms of her time. Yet all of it poured into her work. Every whimsy in the Mary Poppins books is backed by trauma, by loss, by longing. Even the way Mary Poppins arrives and disappears, like a guardian angel or divine visitor, is an echo of the transitory, often disappointing relationships Travers had in her own life. Despite Disney's efforts to sand down the sharp edges of her legacy, Travers remains a complicated figure. She was not a sweet old lady with a twinkle in her eye. She was fierce, stubborn, private, contradictory, and brilliant, a woman who refused to live according to anyone's expectations. Her life was not a cheerful musical. It was a mythic journey full of trials, missteps, transformations, and revelations. And maybe that's exactly what Mary Poppins was always meant to be. Are you a fan of the unsettling yet captivating tale of Lolita? Dive deeper into the world of forbidden desire and twisted relationships with this curated list of movies like Lolita. These films were chosen because they feature similar themes and tones to Lolita, exploring the complexities of obsession, manipulation, and the corruption of innocence. Whether you're intrigued by the dark satire of Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece or craving a psychological thriller that keeps you on the edge of your seat, this list has something for every fan of provocative cinema. Imagine immersing yourself in the chilling exploration of desire and obsession in Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, where morality and free will collide in a dystopian society. Or perhaps you're drawn to the psychological complexities of relationships portrayed in Fish Tank, where a rebellious teenager navigates the tumultuous waters of adolescence amidst family dysfunction and forbidden attraction. These movies on this list have been compiled using votes from cinephiles like you, ensuring a diverse selection of thought-provoking narratives that push the boundaries of storytelling. As you peruse this collection of films, you'll find yourself captivated by the morally ambiguous characters, atmospheric cinematography, and emotionally charged performances that define each cinematic masterpiece. With convenient where-to-watch buttons below each film, streaming services such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, Max, Apple TV+, Hulu, Paramount+, and Disney+ make it easier than ever to embark on your next movie night adventure. So what are you waiting for? Explore the darker side of human nature and vote up your favorite items on the list to help shape the rankings.